Okay, great. So thank you very much, Andrew Bridges. That was really wonderful. Let's turn it over to Christopher Jane Miller. I already did one introduction for Christopher Jane Miller, but I think it bears repeating. He's an impressive enough fellow that I don't mind talking about him and his accomplishments. So Dr. Christopher Jane Miller, of course, is the co-founder, vice president, and the vice president of academic affairs here at Arihanta Institute. He's a professor of yoga and Jain studies here at Arihanta as well. He completed his PhD at University of California, Davis, and he's also a visiting professor at Claremont School of Theology, where Arihanta offers our MA program that we've mentioned multiple times here. And there's also some links in the chat there if you guys can see to some of our programs with Claremont and some of our other Arihanta programs. So Dr. Miller's current research is really focusing on modern yoga and engaged Jainism with an upcoming edited volume with Sunni on that, which I'm co-editing with. So otherwise, here's Dr. Christopher Jane Miller, and welcome, Christopher.
So this paper I'm about to present to you is the paper that will appear in our Engaged Jainism volume. So any feedback you all have as we get ready to publish that, I would really appreciate to hear from you. The title of my paper is Jain Yoga on the Berlin Wall, Narendra Kumar Jain's 7 Stages of Enlightenment, this beautiful mural that you see here in the background. The artistic language is an ineffable language, which many intellectuals do not even understand. Art is the silent language of the heart, in that it communicates only heart to heart, asserted Narendra Kumar Jain in 2021. Jain said this during an interview about his contribution of the mural, The 7 Stages of Enlightenment, to the Berlin Wall's popular East Side Gallery in 1989. Along with this ineffable language, I was immediately captivated by the entangled layers of history, politics, and culture which his mural so clearly conveyed, and which I begin to disentangle here. Even as Jain emphasizes a universal yogic message in the apophatic nature of his mural, he found himself directly engaged with Cold War politics and the international artistic culture operating on both sides of the Berlin Wall before and after its fall. To consider Jain's artistic creation as merely derivative of this context, however, risks missing how he harnessed it in order to visually communicate to his public audiences in Berlin his own Indian culture's situated yogic truths concerning what comprises freedom and enlightenment. His creative choices drawing from yogic traditions also indicate a strategy that Jains in the diaspora use to share their cultural background when the broader communities are not aware of their tradition. I follow a method here of engaged Jain studies from our forthcoming volume, Engaged Jainism, to assess how Jain's ways of knowing brought from India encountered frictions with Euro-American ways of knowing at the Berlin Wall. Engaged Jain Studies adopts Anna Singh's notion of engaged universals and frictions to account for the culturally productive outcomes that occur when universal Jain principles engage with new cultural terrain and wherein Jains attempt to in some way promote their culture. Born in Delhi in 1937, Narendra Kumar Jain is a self-professed Indian fortune teller, yogi, painter, and art historian. He learned yoga from his mother when he was 2, but also from Gandhi, who he says taught him the lotus position when he was 5. Following a lectureship position at the University of Agra that began in 1963, Jain first came to West Berlin in 1967 at the invitation of the German Academic Exchange Service. He arrived amidst an influx of thousands of students and workers from India in the 1960s and 1970s who came to East and West Berlin in the fields of engineering, medicine, and business. He later opened a yoga studio, which you see here, which we find by 2009, according to newspapers, is probably the best in Berlin, and where some consider him as, quote, Berlin's best yoga teacher, end quote. By this time, he had evidently introduced around 70,000 people worldwide to the quote unquote magic of yoga. As we consider Jain's artistic yogic work at the Berlin Wall, we will pay close attention to here following Mitter, the quote, artist's agency, by analyzing art practices and reception as a cultural document that is historically situated, end quote. I do so here by paying attention to what Kumar calls the quote unquote worldly affiliations and the particular representational freedoms that were available to Jain. Affiliation, according to Kumar, who's drawing from Edward Said, quote, denotes a historical process by which a national art world from India came together and became conjoined with an international art world, end quote. Studying Indian modern artists' worldly affiliations requires attention to the social relations and material conditions, which help us see how Indian contemporary art represents, quote, continuity with many projects of the modern. Translation, democracy, secularity, and cosmopolitanism, end quote. And how, quote, problems of visual representation from the colonial period persisted through the post-colonial period, end quote. That's citing Kumar once again. This paper that I'm going to read you now shows how Narendra Kumar Jain's affiliative network influenced and enabled him to paint his 7 stages of enlightenment on the Berlin Wall. Started in early 1989, the first iteration of the mural was in October 1989, which you see here, before the walls fall in November. It conveys a yogic message of enlightenment with a meditating yogi seated above a lotus flower with 7 chakras. The yogi's arms reach up into the air with the right hand depicting Gyan Mudra and the left hand an open palm. In the 2009 refurbishment, which you see here, Jain makes clear that the yogi's open hand is the hand of Christ, with the stigmata representing the West, and the hand in Gyan Mudra represents India and the East. In addition to adding Mahavira's name to the wall, Jain says the mural was intended to connect, quote, Indian mythology and wisdom with Western religions and philosophy, end quote. But also to show how, quote, according to Hindu belief, the practice of yoga makes it possible to progress through the stages of enlightenment, which promise a better existence without suffering, end quote. Jain also says that, quote, 7 stages means 7 chakras. The 7th is full enlightenment, and I tried to interpret them in my Indian manner, end quote. When Jain was asked during an interview, which level of enlightenment have you reached? He replied, quote, that I cannot say. It is a yogi's secret. Geheimnis. This is all, by the way, translated from the original German. Jain's artistic choices to convey the chakra system very broadly reflect the impulses of 20th century internationalist modern artists such as Rabindranath Tagore, who sought to assimilate Western culture and the arts into his own Indian culture. Hungarian Indian painter Amrita Sher Gill and some who would follow her similarly sought to, according to Kumar, quote, cultivate an art that was organic and vital, connected to the past and to the West, and to generate a national culture synthesizing East and West in the wake of colonialism, end quote. Sher Gill and others, quote, believed the task of great art was to establish a connection between national and international community, end quote. Following India's independence in 1947, these twin impulses to develop a national identity and yet maintain a commitment to modern artistic internationalism continued to influence the development of Indian artists. Thought-provoking for our purposes here is how this manifests in neo-tantric art and Indian muralism. Combined with Western abstraction, common elements found in the neo-tantric genre included sexual symbols as well as mystical abstraction marked by the use of Indic symbols. Within this genre, Narendra Kumar Jain's work perhaps best reflects that of G.R. Santosh, whose work, you see here on the left, according to Brown, quote, represents the wider movement of neo-tantric art, end quote. Santosh's work is diametrically opposed to the fragmented spirit of Panikar's work, whose words and symbols you see here on the right had sought to undermine the idea of a monolithic Indian tantric culture. Characterizing Santosh's paintings is instead, writes Brown, a quote, philosophical interpretation committed to the purity of metaphysical categories, wherein the objects, symbols, and practices apparently transcend time and present a unified South Asian cultural heritage. Paraphrasing there, Santosh had a, quote, universal yet Indian conceptual visual well from which to drink, and he and the other neo-tantric artists found an idiom that allowed them to tap into the constructed authenticity of Indian spirituality, so popular in Western culture in the late 1960s and early 1970s, end quote. While Indian artists were contending with the simultaneous sentiments to develop respectable art within the secular, reason-driven space of enlightenment, neo-tantric artists still maintained a commitment to the spiritual, the iconic, and the religious, as you see here. During the same period that neo-tantric art emerged, other Indian artists were inspired by early 20th century Mexican muralism, intended to educate the illiterate public concerning the history of Mexico following the Mexican Revolution. Indian artist Satish Gurjal had studied muralism in Mexico with the famous muralists Diego Rivera and David Siqueiros in the 1950s. Following Gurjal, Indian artists including Subramanian and Mukherjee at Kalabhavan also began to use murals as a way to engage with a larger public in India. Subramanian's mural project, The Wheel at Gandhi Darshan, for example, evokes Gandhi's ideal village republics through a wheel, connoting at once the Dharma Chakra and the Charka. Subramanian undertook such projects in the 1960s and 70s in the face of India's accelerated development, aiming toward a synthesis and the conjoining of the opposed forces of tradition and modernity. A crucial transition begins, however, in the 1980s, where Indian art is meant to create a conscious intervention into global and not just Indian history. Trained in art and art history in India and Germany, Narendra Kumar Jain emerges at the Berlin Wall at this point to paint his mural. His work represents an internalized neo-tantric approach to enlightenment, visually materialized in his 7 chakras. Jain's understanding of the yogic subtle body, including the chakra system, reflects common models that were popularized in the crucible of the Indian Bhadralok's encounters with colonial and romantic Orientalist influences. Here, elite Indians and Europeans co-constructed an idealized, textually mediated yogic body from pre-existing South Asian practice lineages and Sanskrit yoga scriptures in the early 20th century. The chakra system that emerges in this context has textual origins in the 10th century tantric text titled Kubjika Mata Tantra. This text shows a similar 6-chakra system as part of its non-dual tantric system that would eventually spread through Europe and India through texts. This happened perhaps most prominently in the 1919 work of Arthur Avalon, which you see pictured here on the right, who democratized the internalized chakra system for the Western and Indian middle classes through his still highly influential English publication of the Shat Chakra Nirupana, 16th century tantric text, a scripture from Kalashaivism's Southern transmission. This text also discusses Sahasrara, the 7th chakra, which Jain included in his mural, which you can see here at the very top of the picture on the far right. Before Avalon's work, the chakra system was already becoming known in German-speaking Europe, including in the work of anthroposophist Rudolf Steiner, who mapped the chakras onto the Western astral body in 1909, and later Werner Bohm, who popularized the system in German-speaking regions in his book titled Chakras in 1953. The chakra system found institutional popularity in German yoga organizations, including the German Yoga Society, whose 4-year yoga therapist training established in 1982 included, quote, theory and practice of mystical physiology, chakras, etc., end quote. This time period coincides with what Fuchs describes as a quote-unquote veritable boom in yoga in West Germany, and even the public recognition of yoga in the GDR in East Germany, where yoga courses had become established in almost every large city. Yoga Vidya, a major yoga organization in Germany founded upon the teachings of the famous Swami Shivananda Saraswati, still uses Avalon's translation of the Shat Chakra Nirupana to teach the chakra system today. Those involved in these yoga teaching pursuits have been selectively gleaning material from medieval tantric and hatha yoga texts that had begun to internalize, as James Mallinson has shown, these external sexual Kaula tantric practices within the yogic subtle body in medieval India, thereby following what Burchett describes as a pre-colonial bhakti sensibility from North Indian forms of yoga practice that were highly compatible with later European and Victorian sensibilities. I have in my own new book, Embodying Transnational Yoga, described the contemporary transnational dissemination of these internalized yoga systems as engaged alchemies, to convey the processes through which yoga teachers have brought yogic subtle body logics into contemporary social environments globally. Jain's mural clearly reproduces the history I have outlined here. That's why I've gone so much into it. He's capitalizing upon the popularity of what has become a well-known transnational yoga system, commonly conveying a spiritual journey through 7 chakras on the path toward enlightenment. At the Berlin Wall, Jain encountered a fitting social and historical moment that was well prepared to receive his work. Scholars considering the Berlin Wall more broadly have described its location as a site of creative speculation and a place of engagement for engaged forms of cultural diplomacy that eventually gave rise to countercultural communities and expressive spaces beyond governmental oversight, where artists from both sides of the wall were constantly engaged with one another. And following the wall's fall on November 9th, 1989, the subcultures of East and West collided in the ruins of Eastern Berlin, where, as Hokenos observes, the quote, boundless, untended spaces invited improvisation, end quote, including at the East Side Gallery where Jain would paint. Narendra Kumar Jain's mural stands here along the Spree River amidst the 105 murals from an international group of artists sharing particular messages of freedom. Part of what makes Jain's contribution to the gallery so important is that he began to paint his mural in East Germany, the border of which was the Spree River, in March of 1989, which of course is well before the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. Crossing the Oberbaum Bridge, each time to paint the mural on the wall just on the other side of the Spree, Jain was entering potentially dangerous territory. He nevertheless began his mural in the spring of 1989 with the encouragement of his German colleague David Monti, who you see pictured here, since Jain had an Indian visa, which allowed him to enter East Berlin. These enabling factors are significant as they demonstrate the complex international political landscape in which Jain was working and how Jain's work was particularly enabled through his affiliative network, following Kumar once again, that had depended on him as an Indian artist to help accomplish the gallery's goals. Nobody else could go across to the other side to paint. Jain was a perfect candidate to help get the project moving before the wall fell, since India, of course, belonged to the non-alignment movement, through which many formerly colonized nations refused to side with either the US or the Soviet Union. This political situation made it much easier for Indians such as Jain to acquire a visa to study and work in East and West Berlin without the kind of fear or prohibitions that members of other Western nations often had. Aware of Jain's very special status as an Indian citizen, West Berliner David Monti invited Jain to join the open-air mural gallery project that he was organizing with his colleague from East Berlin, Heike Stephan. Monti had personal connections to the border guards and encouraged them to allow Jain to cross to East Berlin to paint his mural with his visa. So all of Jain's worldly affiliations that we see here outlined in this paper clearly enabled him to paint his mural. As art historian Kumar shows, Said's notion of worldly affiliations, or just affiliations as he would call them, encourage us to focus on the social relations and material conditions that show how Indian modern art is constituted by the world, as you see here quoted. However, Kumar also encourages us to pay attention to Spivak's notion of re-worlding, which you see here quoted, which, just the opposite, quote, shows how the world is produced by and through the imagination, end quote, and thus how Indian modern art simultaneously constitutes the world and how the image can actually become a world. Consider then how Jain's mural is wedged between 2 murals depicting seemingly universal Western messages of freedom, liberation, and enlightenment. To the right, we find Italian artist Fulvio Pina's Hymn to Joy, the express intention of which is to, quote, remind everyone that all people are born free, but many have to live in bondage, end quote. To the left of Jain's mural is a space that reserved for a message from the United States. Here we find Bierbrauer's caricature of the Statue of Liberty, wherein Libertas, the Roman goddess of liberty, conveys, according to the United States, a, quote, symbol of enlightenment, which lights the way to freedom, showing us the path to liberty. Liberty enlightening the world, end quote. These murals that are flanking Jain's at the East Side Gallery celebrate ideas of freedom that are born from the European and American Enlightenments, which had also produced the seemingly universal but now fractured pursuits of Western modernity. Jain's mural, situated as it is here, entangles his own universal yogic notions into the mix. Rather than beginning from Pina's notion that people are born free on the right here, Jain's mural instead expresses the notion drawn from a number of Indic traditions, which assumes that people are instead perpetually reborn into suffering and bondage. And rather than conveying libertas as liberty enlightening the world, freedom from suffering only comes in Jain's model after a progressive journey through 7 chakras, where we then find yoga enlightening the world. Judging from Jain's inclusion here of Christ's hand on one side of the mural representing the West, and the yogi's hand on the other representing India and the East, the yogi in Jain's 7 stages of enlightenment that you see here achieves a form of universal yogic enlightenment that now unites the colonially constructed binary between East and West. But also consider how East and West take one further and perhaps more specific meaning in Jain's work here at the Berlin Wall. As the two seemingly opposed worlds of East and West Germany remained divided by a slab of concrete surrounded by danger, Jain brought yoga's popular unifying message to the second position in the East Side Gallery in 1989, even before other artists were able to begin their work. Jain thereby depicted yoga's universal path to enlightenment and unification through the structures and the representational freedoms that were mediated to him there, and that were definitely constituted by Germany and India's past and present. However, the fortune teller yogi's mural was also potentially prophetic, insofar as it seemed to be constituting and reworlding a message of future German unity months in advance of the wall's fall, as well as you can see in this picture, yogis and yoginis' apparently never-ending pursuit of the 7 stages of enlightenment, a tradition his current yoga students pictured here continue in Berlin today. Being born into the Jain tradition, and yet in a European country unfamiliar with it, Jain capitalized on the popularity of an internalized tantric hatha yoga to express his cultural identity, rather than using the Jain tradition itself. Following anthropologist Anna Singh, Jain's yogic universal became an engaged universal at the Berlin Wall, where it continues to express his Indian culture's promise of freedom and enlightenment to the visiting public. Thank you.
Wow, that was really rich presentation, Dr. Miller. Thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. So many important themes there. And what a visually stunning presentation as well. It was really nice to walk through the beautiful artwork for what is an early morning for me, or earlier in the day here. It's nice to see that first thing in the morning. It's so stimulating. So thank you for a beautiful presentation. I'm sure there will be questions and comments about that. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll address those at the end of the first half of the conference during the Q&A section.